Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that's dark, dangerous, and far less glamorous than Hollywood would have you believe, the world of medieval assassins. Picture this: narrow castle corridors, flickering torchlight, and shadowy alleyways where a single wrong move could cost you your life. While movies and video games make this life seem thrilling, the reality, it was anything but. These were not heroes trained in mountaintop temples, moving gracefully to the sound of epic music. No, this was survival at its most brutal. Before we dive into the story, take a second to like this video and hit that subscribe button if you enjoy content that peels back the layers of history, revealing the truth behind the myths. And drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're rewatching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who joining our journey through time. Okay, now dim the lights, maybe turn on a small fan for that gentle background hum, and let yourself sink into the eerie, gripping world we're about to explore. Imagine waking up in a time when life was harsh, social mobility was limited, and the choices available to you were often dictated by sheer desperation. Becoming an assassin wasn't a career choice. It was usually a last resort, a path taken by those society had already chewed up and spit out. Peasants, disgraced soldiers, and former thieves became the footnotes of history, the invisible, feared figures operating in the shadows for a handful of coins and the chance to survive another day. And here's the thing, nobody in the Middle Ages woke up saying, "Today, I want to assassinate a nobleman and hide in a barrel for 3 days." It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't honorable, and there were no inspirational mentors waiting to guide you. The training was real, harsh, and personal. Bruises, sleepless nights, and the constant fear that a single mistake could be your last. Every dagger, every poison drink, every plan relied entirely on cunning, patience, and sheer nerve. In this video, we're going to peel back the myths and look at the truth behind these shadowy figures, their struggles, their fears, and their brutal reality. We'll also explore the deadly world of poison, the impossibly dangerous castle defenses, and the paranoia that hung over them like a shadow they could never shake. By the end of this journey, you will see why being a medieval assassin was less about glory and more about survival, and maybe even start to appreciate just how far humanity has come in terms of safety and security. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive into a story that's as fascinating as it is chilling. Don't forget, you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history. Give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a journey like this one. Now, let us step into the shadows together and see what it really meant to live and survive the world of medieval assassins. As we step further into the shadowy corridors of medieval history, it quickly becomes clear that the assassins of that era were nothing like the sleek, heroic figures that flicker across the silver screen or the fast-paced worlds of video games, where every movement seems calculated, elegant, and somehow cinematic. The truth is far grimmer and far less romantic. Medieval assassins were often the forgotten edges of society, people who had been battered by circumstance, and circumstance alone had pushed them into a life where survival depended on cunning, speed, and a constant awareness that any misstep could mean not just failure, but a violent, unceremonious end. Unlike the stylized heroes with flowing cloaks and choreographed combat sequences, these men and women moved through a world of crime, fear, and relentless danger, where every alleyway and castle hall was a potential trap, and trust was a currency they could never afford to spend. It wasn't skill or honor or a personal code that led someone to this life. It was necessity, desperation, and, sometimes, sheer bad luck, leaving them little choice but to adapt or disappear entirely. Consider the reality of their daily existence, waking in dark, cramped spaces, often in stables, abandoned buildings, or under the leaky roofs of inns that would never welcome a noble, and knowing that the daylight hours would be spent planning how to move unseen, how to slip past guards with hawk-like vigilance, and how to anticipate the reactions of those who had everything to lose and nothing to fear in confronting a shadow. There were no teachers instructing them in the ways of the silent kill, no mentors to offer encouragement, no heroic narratives to guide them. Every skill they acquired, every precise step, every calculated breath, every flick of the wrist was learned through harsh experience, through bruises that never fully healed, through mistakes that could not be corrected, through nights spent lying awake, listening for the slightest hint that someone had noticed, someone had spoken, someone had recognized their presence in a world that was, quite literally, trying to erase them. Unlike a soldier who might rise in rank, or a craftsman who could gain respect for skill and patience, an assassin's success was fleeting, measured only by survival and the ability to vanish without a trace, leaving behind no accolades, no recognition, and no record that could ever justify the risks they took. And yet, in this darkness, there was a strange kind of discipline, not born from honor or moral code, but from necessity, from the intimate knowledge that even a small miscalculation in a tolled century, a misjudged shadow, a noisy floorboard, could turn a life of careful stealth into a violent, chaotic struggle for survival that offered no chance of heroism, no dramatic reveal, and certainly no cinematic victory. In truth, medieval assassins were neither villains nor heroes. They were the footnotes of history, the unseen gears that sometimes moved the machinery of kingdoms, wars, and politics, yet themselves rarely recorded or remembered. Their existence a constant negotiation between danger, desperation, and the cold reality that in a world ruled by power and fear, invisibility was not just an advantage, it was the only form of protection that might allow them to see another day. Beneath the shadowed world of castle walls and cobblestone alleys, the people who became assassins were rarely born into privilege or circumstance that might have offered them choice. Instead, they were the overlooked and the outcast, the ones whom society had discarded long before they ever picked up a dagger. And yet, the world depended upon them in ways that few ever realized. Peasants, whose hands were calloused from labor, and whose faces bore the sun-baked lines of endless toil, found themselves with few opportunities beyond the fields, the mills, or the merciless grip of local lords who demanded obedience and offered little in return. And when misfortune struck crop failure, debt, or accusations, they sometimes turned to a life of shadow, to a trade where the coin they earned was the only measure of their worth, even if that coin was steeped in blood. Disgraced soldiers, men who had once held swords in the defense of a lord or a kingdom, returned from battle not as heroes, but as broken figures, haunted by survival, wounded in body or spirit, their reputations shattered, their honor in tatters, and when no one else would give them employment, the life of secrecy and danger offered a grim but viable alternative, a way to wield their skills without needing a banner or a cause to justify them. And then there were the ex-thieves, the ones who had lived their lives on the margins, learning stealth and cunning as a matter of survival rather than choice. People whose hands were quick, whose eyes missed nothing, whose experience in the shadows of marketplaces and taverns gave them an almost instinctual ability to move unseen, to vanish when noticed, strike only when the odds were in their favor. And yet, even they entered the world of assassination reluctantly, understanding that crossing into this line of work meant committing fully to a life in which every step could be your last, and every success came with a price measured not in safety, but in fear. And it is this desperation, this convergence of misfortune and skill, that defines the reality of medieval assassins far more than any notion of glory or fame, because these were not calculated, methodical warriors choosing a career. They were survivors adapting to a world that offered them no other refuge, no other path to recognition, certainly no certainty that their lives would last long enough to count any victories at all. Each step they took was measured against the weight of necessity. each movement dictated by an awareness of how precarious their position truly was, and each assignment they accepted was less an ambition and more a gamble. One where the stakes were life itself, and the cost of failure was final, absolute, and irreversible. In this way, the medieval assassin is not merely a figure of history, but a testament to human resilience under pressure. A reminder that even in the bleakest circumstances, people find ways to adapt, survive, and exert influence, even when the world has otherwise written them off, and yet, in surviving, they become shadows, unseen and unremembered, operating in the spaces where history's grand narratives brush lightly against the edges of human desperation, cleaving behind stories of cunning, fear, and the relentless pursuit of survival that few ever fully comprehend. For most of these individuals, stepping into the world of assassination was not a glamorous choice, nor was it a path paved with ambition or desire. Rather, it was the bitter, unavoidable reality of lives shaped by misfortune, limited opportunity, and relentless necessity. A path chosen only when every other door had closed and every other avenue for survival had been exhausted, leaving behind a narrow corridor in which secrecy, skill, and sheer audacity were the only means to continue living. Unlike the carefully orchestrated training montages and heroic backstories imagined by storytellers, the life of a medieval assassin often began with a misstep in the social orderer failed harvest. A lost battle, a crime that carried more consequences than redemption events, that left ordinary people suddenly confronting an extraordinary and dangerous choice: continue existing at the mercy of circumstance, or take control in the only way available through cunning, stealth, and a willingness to perform acts that society will label morally abhorrent, yet which in that brutal context were often indistinguishable from survival. The decision to become an assassin rarely came from a desire for power or status. It was a response to the harsh reality that the world of medieval Europe offered few second chances, and even fewer paths for those without birthright, skill in arms, or connections to protect them from the ceaseless pressures of poverty, political intrigue, and social exclusion. A peasant who had lost everything might find in assassination a fleeting opportunity to trade skill for coin, to assert control over a small corner of a world that otherwise ignored them, while a disgraced soldier, dishonored and unemployed, could leverage the combat training that had once made him a defender of the realm into a survival mechanism that depended on precision, timing, and an unflinching acceptance of constant danger. Even ex-thieves, accustomed to moving unseen and taking what they needed to survive, confronted the moral and practical consequences of stepping into a life where failure meant death, and success meant only a temporary reprieve in a world that measured value in blood, silence, and the ability to vanish without leaving evidence. In this way, the medieval assassin's career, such as it was never a matter of choice in the modern sense of the word. It was a last resort, the outcome of lives pushed to the margins. A grim acknowledgement that when society turns its back and conventional avenues of survival have been exhausted, the only way forward is to embrace danger, secrecy, and a form of labor that the world fears and condemns, which, at its core, demands intelligence, patience, and a cold, methodical courage that is almost never appreciated or acknowledged. The assassin's existence was a constant negotiation with fate. Life lived in suspended tension between the need to survive and the desire to remain unseen, a path that promised neither glory nor recognition, only the fragile hope that one more day, one more assignment, one more shadowed movement through the streets and halls of a world indifferent to their plight would allow them to continue another day, another week, another month, in a society that offered little forgiveness, little mercy, and even less understanding. Once an individual accepted the grim reality of this line of work, they entered a world defined entirely by shadows, silence, and the constant calculation of risk. A world where every movement could betray them, and every acquaintance could could unknowingly become the instrument of their undoing. And in this realm of perpetual tension, survival was never guaranteed beyond the very next assignment. Operating in secrecy was not merely a professional requirement, it was the air they breathed, the lens through which they viewed every street, every corridor, and every crowded tavern. Their eyes learned to notice the smallest irregularity. A shift in a shadow, a footstep too loud, a glance that lingered too long, because in the medieval city, where walls were thin, gates were guarded, and the social hierarchy was unforgiving, the slightest miscalculation could turn a successful strike into a fatal exposure. They moved like whispers, slipping beneath moonlight and into alleyways, tucking behind barrows and waiting in silent corners for the perfect moment to act, knowing that hesitation could ruin everything, yet at the same time understanding that haste could be equally deadly. And so each decision, each step, each careful breath was taken with a level of awareness and patience that few outside their world could imagine. Yet, even when an assignment was executed flawlessly, even when the target fell without a sound, the assassin's safety was never assured, for the world beyond that single act remained as perilous as ever. They were often hunted, not by the authorities who turned a blind eye, but by rival factions, betrayed clients, or competing killers, all of whom recognized the value of eliminating someone who possessed both skill and knowledge that could threaten their own plans. And so, the life of a medieval assassin was a fragile thread, easily snapped, a balance maintained between triumph and oblivion, where the celebration of success was as fleeting as the shadow that concealed them. There were no parades, no rewards, no monuments carved into stone to commemorate their deeds. Instead, there was the constant pressure of moving on, disappearing into a new town, adopting a new identity, and immediately blending into the crowd as if the previous life had never existed, for it to linger, to rest too long, or to allow familiarity to grow, to invite death with the casual inevitability of dawn following night, cute in this hidden, perilous existence. Every success came with a built-in expiration date. The moment the job was done, the world shifted its focus, and the assassin, now both unseen and hunted, became a ghost, not just to society, but often to themselves, their identity dissolving into the endless stream of alleys, forests, and towns that they traversed. Always alert, always calculating, and always aware that one misstep, one misplaced trust, one overlooked guard, one misjudged angle of escape would bring an abrupt and unceremonious end to a life that had been defined by secrecy and peril from the very beginning. To live as a medieval assassin was to exist perpetually on the knife's edge, never knowing whether the next shadow would conceal safety or doom, and it is this relentless, unforgiving tension that defines their story. Far removed from the glamour of fiction, grounded instead in the stark, uncompromising reality of a life in which secrecy was survival, and survival was never assured beyond the next heartbeat. Unlike the sweeping, dramatic scenes that modern audiences imagine, where a young recruit is guided by a wise mentor through candlelit halls, enduring rigorous lessons set to triumphant music, the reality of training for a medieval assassin was brutally pragmatic, insentimental, and entirely self-directed, a process that demanded adaptation, observation, and trial and error under conditions so unforgiving that even the smallest mistake could mean death. And there was no one to offer encouragement, no structured curriculum, certainly no promises of recognition or reward beyond the fleeting success of a single, perfectly executed mission. These individuals did not attend schools of shadowy wisdom, nor were they privy to the secrets of ancient texts preserved in hidden monasteries. Instead, their education came in the form of the streets themselves, the castles they infiltrated, the taverns they observed, and the mistakes they survived, or, perhaps more accurately, barely survived, learning from bruises, blood, and the silent, unforgiving calculus of risk and consequence. Every movement was a lesson. Every escape from discovery, a validation of instinct honed through necessity. In every failure, a harsh, often permanent, reminder that survival depended not on inspiration or guidance, but on the relentless sharpening of skill. It's a careful study of human behavior and the ability to think several steps ahead in a world where the cost of misjudgment was final. The tools of their trade were similarly stripped of any grandeur or ceremony. There were no ornate blades passed down through secret lineages, no ceremonial daggers with inscriptions that promised destiny or honor. Their weapons were functional, chosen for reliability and discretion, each one carrying the silent expectation that it would serve as both instrument of survival and measure of skill. Often maintained under conditions that were far from ideal, dulled by repeated use, exposed to moisture, and cleaned hurriedly in the dark, leaving a lingering, unmistakable scent of labor, blood, and desperation. Similarly, poison sieve they were employed at all were unpredictable, concocted from herbs, minerals, or other natural substances, requiring not only knowledge, but patience and intuition to administer safely. Yet, even the most carefully prepared dose carried the constant threat of failure, miscalculation, or unintended exposure, underscoring the precarious nature of a profession that relied as much on cunning and timing as it did on physical skill. And yet, it was precisely in this absence of formal instruction that the assassin's resilience and ingenuity were forged. Each step through a castle corridor, each hidden approach through a crowded marketplace, each improvised tool or weapon became a part of an education that was entirely experiential, where the line between learning and life or death consequence was virtually invisible, and where the knowledge gained was never theoretical but immediate, tested by reality in ways that no textbook or mentor could replicate. In essence, the medieval assassin was both student and teacher, innovator and executor, constantly refining their craft in a world that offered neither guidance nor leniency, where every lesson was written in bruises, bloodstains, and the quiet, almost invisible victories that allowed them to continue existing in the shadows, unseen, unheard, and unrecorded, yet infinitely observant, patient, and relentlessly prepared for whatever danger awaited beyond the next corner or behind the next locked door. In this world, devoid of formal instruction or guiding mentors, the education of a medieval assassin was forged entirely through experience, a relentless curriculum dictated by trial, error, bruises, and blood, where every misstep became a lesson etched into muscle memory, and every scrape or cut was a stark reminder of the fine line between survival and oblivion. And the learning itself was as much about understanding one's environment as it was about mastering weapons or poisons. For the landscape of medieval Europe, the narrow alleys, uneven streets, crowded marketplaces, and imposing castles offered both opportunity and lethal threat in equal measure. There were no diagrams to illustrate the safest route past a guard, no textbooks to outline the chemical composition of a herb or mineral, no practice sessions with a fellow apprentice who could cushion a mistake. Instead, the assassin's education came from living in a constant state of heightened awareness, testing boundaries in the quiet of night, observing reactions in crowded spaces, and adjusting instantly when a plan failed, often learning the hard way that a single unnoticed squeak of a floorboard, a shadow that fell at the wrong angle, or a dagger that failed to find its mark could undo months of careful planning in an instant. Each failure was immediate, visceral, and unforgettable, leaving behind not just physical reminders, bruises, bloodstains, and aching muscles, but also psychological imprints, the creeping understanding that in this life, perfection was not optional, but essential, and that learning through mistakes was the only way to survive long enough to gain even the faintest mastery over one's surroundings and one's own instincts. For instance, a single miscalculated jump from a wall could result in a twisted ankle that made every future escape slower and more perilous, while underestimating the alertness of a household servant could alert guards before a plan had even begun, forcing a desperate retreat under the cover of darkness and leaving the would-be assassin to nurse both humiliation and pain, all while recalibrating mental strategies to avoid repeating the same error in the future. Similarly, experiments with poisons, often crafted from herbs, mushrooms, or minerals, carried enormous risks. A misjudged dose could render the intended target unharmed or, worse, alert them to the threat, while the preparer risked exposure or accidental self-poisoning. It's learning in the most immediate and personal way that the art of subtlety and precision demanded patience, knowledge, and constant vigilance, all acquired without guidance, entirely through hands-on experience and the unrelenting pressure of survival. Over time, this brutal, practical education shaped not only the body, but the mind, creating individuals who could calculate distances, anticipate reactions, and move with an almost instinctual awareness of space and timing, all honed in a crucible where mistakes were unforgiving and consequences were permanent. And yet, despite the cruelty of the process, this relentless trial-and-error approach produced assassins who were adaptable, innovative, and acutely attuned to the human and environmental variables around them, proving that in a world without guidance, without mentors, without safety nets, the harshest of lessons could create the most precise, cautious, and formidable operators, whose survival depended entirely on the lessons they learned in the quiet, blood-stained, bruised corridors of experience, where every action and reaction carried the weight of life or death, and where the price of mastery was measured not in achievement or recognition, but in sheer, unbroken survival. In a world where guidance was absent and mistakes could be fatal, medieval assassins had no choice but to depend entirely on their own skills and survival instincts, a reliance that shaped every thought, every movement, and every decision they made, forcing them to become masters of observation, intuition, and improvisation in a society that offered no mercy and no second chances. And in doing so, they developed a kind of vigilance that was almost unnatural, a mental state where danger was perceived in the smallest details, the angle of a shadow across a courtyard, the rhythm of footsteps on stone, the faint creak of a door hinge that signaled an approaching threat, and even the subtle shifts in a noble household, where a misstep in timing could turn an ordinary corridor into a trap lined with armed guards. Every sense became a tool of survival, every instinct a weapon, and every decision carried the weight of consequences that were immediate and irreversible. And because there were no mentors to teach strategy or no manuals to outline procedure, Tassa's mind became both laboratory and battlefield, constantly testing, predicting, and calculating the outcomes of each action in a world that was indifferent, hostile, and unforgiving. Reliance on personal skill meant that an assassin had to be endlessly adaptable, able to improvise when a plan went awry and to exploit opportunities that appeared unexpectedly. Whether that was taking advantage of a distracted guard, slipping through an unnoticed opening in a city wall, or finding a hidden path that had never been documented in any map. In every successful evasion, every narrow escape reinforced the critical importance of instinct, teaching lessons that could never be learned in a classroom or from a mentor. Lessons about timing, patience, and a delicate balance between boldness and caution. It was not enough to be fast or strong. Survival demanded an acute awareness of human behavior, an understanding of the fears, routines, vulnerabilities of those around them, and the ability to predict reactions before they happened. One misjudgment could expose not only themselves, but the fragile threads of the mission itself. This reliance on skill and instinct extended beyond immediate danger to every aspect of their existence, acquiring tools, preparing makeshift disguises, navigating unfamiliar towns, and even managing their own fears and exhaustion. Because in the absence of a support network, they had no one to rely on but themselves. No backup plan to rescue them if a situation went wrong, and no recognition to soften the burden of stress or isolation. In essence, The medieval assassin was a solitary figure forged by necessity, a person whose life demanded constant vigilance. His mind was a finely tuned instrument of perception and calculation, and whose very survival depended on the flawless execution of skills honed in a crucible of danger, trial, and relentless pressure, proving that when society turns its back and guidance is absent, the only true currency of survival is the ability to trust one's own instincts, to act decisively in moments of peril, and to navigate a world where each choice carries the weight of life and death, and where every shadow may conceal either opportunity or annihilation. For most medieval assassins, the driving force behind their perilous existence was the promise of coin, cold, tangible, and tantalizing, a reward that seemed to justify the constant risk of death, the endless nights spent in shadows, and the heavy burden of moral ambiguity. Yet the reality of this payment was far less dependable than the fantasies of those who imagined the life from a distance. For the contracts they accepted were rarely accompanied by guarantees, and trust was a luxury that could not be afforded. Payment often came in secret, sometimes delayed, sometimes insufficient. And in a society where social structures were rigid and legal protections practically non-existent, the assassin was left with little recourse if a client reneged or disappeared before the agreed-upon coin exchanged hands. The work itself was designed to erase evidence of both deed and doer, meaning that the very success of a mission could simultaneously erase any hope of claiming rewards safely. And the assassin had to navigate this delicate balance, often leaving the scene of a perfectly executed strike with nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of survival and the slim hope that the promised coin would arrive before their presence or absence drew unwelcome attention. This unreliability of reward created a paradoxical existence in which the assassin was both skilled and expendable, valued for their abilities but considered disposable by those who hired them. And the constant uncertainty surrounding payment heightened the stakes in ways that extended beyond the immediate threat of discovery or death. Many assassins found themselves forced to improvise, accepting multiple assignments simultaneously, calculating which contracts were worth the risk, or devising clever ways to secure their earnings before vanishing into anonymity once more, all while maintaining the delicate balance of appearing inconspicuous, avoiding suspicion, and ensuring that their survival instincts were honed to perfection, for any misstep could jeopardize both life and livelihood. Even when coin finally changed hands, it often came in a form that was far from ideal: small, heavy silver coins that jangled in pockets or pouches, insufficient to provide comfort, security, or the promise of a future. Yet it was enough to keep the assassin moving, enough to justify another assignment, another night in darkness, another calculated risk. And the pursuit of survival became inseparable from the pursuit of payment, so that the two were intertwined in a way that left little room for sentiment or hesitation. Money, in this brutal calculus, was both incentive and obsession, a lifeline that allowed these men and women to continue navigating a world where every shadow could conceal danger, every acquaintance could betray them, and every plan carried the weight of uncertainty. And it is precisely this tension between reward and risk, reliability and unpredictability, that defined the true nature of motivation for medieval assassins, grounding their existence not in glory or ambition, but in the unrelenting necessity of survival and the fragile promise of coin that, mid-tour, might not arrive when the danger had passed. In the shadowed world of medieval assassins, each assignment was ephemeral, fleeting, and absolute in its finality, a singular act that demanded total precision and left behind no guarantees, no enduring recognition, and certainly no loyalty from those who had employed their services. For in a society where secrecy was paramount and discretion demanded erasure, the assassin was both indispensable and expendable, a tool to be wielded once and then discarded. And it was this brutal impermanence that defined not just their work, but their entire existence. A life where the only constant was danger, and the only reward was the fragile, fleeting satisfaction of completing a task without detection. Unlike trades, where experience accumulates into a career, where skill is rewarded with respect, or where one's name can grow synonymous with achievement, the medieval assassin existed in a vacuum. Their deeds unrecorded, their successes invisible, their failures fatal, and the very nature of the profession ensured that no contract could bind the employer beyond the completion of a single, violent, and clandestine objective. This one-off structure demanded adaptability, for each job brought its own unique set of challenges, environments, and adversaries. And there was no roadmap from one assignment to the next, no mentor to debrief, no guild to provide protection or advice, and certainly no guarantee that survival in one city would translate to safety in another. An assassin might vanish into a town under a borrowed name, execute a perfectly timed strike, and within hours or days be forced to leave everything familiar behind, not out of choice but necessity, knowing that lingering in one place too long could invite discovery, retribution, or the inevitable betrayal that was as common in medieval power struggles as the passing of seasons. The work was intensely personal, yet paradoxically impersonal, for while it required extreme skill, courage, and cunning, did not cultivate relationships, reputations, or loyalty. It demanded only that the mission be completed, the target eliminated, and the assassin disappear into the night, leaving the world none the wiser and leaving themselves perpetually exposed to the uncertainty of who might come after them next. Even more cruelly, this structure meant that an assassin could never rest on past accomplishments. For each new assignment, reset the slate entirely, rendering previous successes irrelevant and irrelevant, and forcing them to prove themselves over and over again under the same relentless pressure, yet without the promise of continuity, stability, or community. And it was this constant state of impermanence that shaped their entire worldview: to trust no one, to rely solely on personal skill and instinct, to value every fleeting coin as both reward and lifeline, and to accept that in a profession where loyalty was transactional, security was non-existent, and survival was always uncertain. The only true measure of success was not accolades or recognition, but the unbroken continuation of life itself from one shadow job to the next. In the perilous economy of medieval assassination, trust was the rarest currency of all. For the very clients who summoned these shadowed figures into existence often viewed them not as partners or allies, but as disposable instruments whose value ceased the moment the task was complete. And it was not uncommon for a contract to carry an implicit expiration date, measured not in weeks or months, but in the fleeting breath between the final act and the next step in a ruthless game of survival. The concept of plausible deniability governed every decision, every interaction, and every payment, compelling clients to operate as though the assassin's existence were an inconvenient variable to be managed, rather than a professional relationship to be nurtured. And in the cold calculus of power, it was safer to assume that anyone capable of eliminating a target could also be eliminated once their usefulness had ended. There are accounts scattered through the annals of history and whispered in the margins of legal and literary records, where the very assassin who had been entrusted with a high-stakes job found themselves targeted by another hand hired by the same client, a lethal safety net designed to sever any loose ends and erase evidence, leaving the first assassin to confront the grim possibility that completing the mission successfully might simultaneously mark the beginning of a personal death sentence. This pervasive threat of betrayal added an extra layer of tension to an already unforgiving existence, for even the most skilled and cautious operative could not rely on loyalty, goodwill, or the promise of compensation to secure their survival. And every step after a completed job became a calculated movement through a landscape where danger was not just external, but intimately entwined with the very reason they had been hired. The people who demanded their talents might also demand their silence permanently. In such a world, preparation and stealth were no longer merely tools for executing the primary assignment. They were essential strategies for preserving one's own life in the aftermath, requiring the assassin to vanish almost immediately. 2. Shed identity and location with a precision rivaling the original act itself. To slip into the folds of anonymity as though they had never existed. Because lingering in one place, celebrating success, or attempting to claim payment too openly was tantamount to inviting death. This brutal reality meant that an assassin's life was perpetually unstable, a delicate balance between completing the mission for survival, anticipating the potential treachery of those who had employed them, constantly calculating the next safe move in a world where enemies could hide in plain sight, and betrayal was often as carefully orchestrated as the original strike itself. The psychological burden was immense, knowing that the very people who had promised coin and reward could, at any moment, replace them with another blade, and that any misstep in timing, disguise, or exit strategy could convert success into immediate peril, instilling a sense of vigilance that never waned, a mental strain that accompanied every step, every breath, and every shadowed corner, leaving the assassin to navigate not only the dangers of their environment, but the calculated cunning of those who had summoned them into this dangerous, merciless life in the first place. The tools of a medieval assassin were deceptively simple, yet they carried a weight and significance far beyond their modest appearance. For unlike the finely decorated blades, often romanticized in modern tales of intrigue and adventure, the weapons in the hands of these shadowed figures were chosen not for beauty, not for symbolism, but for raw functionality and reliability, honed to a lethal edge that could slice silently, efficiently, and without drawing unnecessary attention. A stark contrast to the ornate daggers and ceremonial swords that might adorn a noble S-belt or gleam in the ceremonial halls of a castle, serving as a testament to status rather than survival. Every dagger, every sharpened edge, every improvised weapon had to meet the unforgiving criteria of practicality. It needed to fit in the hand comfortably, to strike with precision, to be concealable within layers of clothing or hidden beneath the folds of a cloak, and to remain sharp and usable even after repeated use under harsh conditions, often maintained in secrecy with only rudimentary oiling and weighting. And it was this simplicity that rendered them deadly, for the assassin could rely on consistency and familiarity rather than artistry or display. And in a profession where hesitation or unpredictability could be fatal, the ordinary blade became an extraordinary instrument of survival. Techniques, likewise, were grounded in pragmatism rather than flair, learned through observation, experimentation, and necessity rather than formal instruction or dramatic training sequences. And the assassin's mastery over their tools was inseparable from their environment, their instincts, and their ability to adapt to unforeseen challenges. Whether that meant plunging a dagger into the shadowed corner of a guardhouse, delivering a swift incapacitation in a crowded tavern without drawing attention, or using the architecture of a city to manipulate angles and leverage, turning stairs, walls, and narrow passages into extensions of their own strategy. Every strike, every calculated movement, every use of improvised weapons became a part of a continuous education in survival, a relentless practice in which even the most mundane implement, be it a kitchen knife, a sharpened piece of metal, or a crude but effective blade, could determine life or death, teaching lessons that no mentor, no manual, and no staged sequence of exercises could replicate. The simplicity of the assassin's tools also reflected the precariousness of their existence, for there was rarely time to craft or acquire elaborate weapons, and ostentation was as dangerous as inexperience, drawing attention to a person whose survival depended on invisibility and discretion. Yet within this austere arsenal, there was elegance not in decoration, but in the harmony of purpose, the marriage of skill and implement, the quiet efficiency of a tool that had been tested in countless escapes, narrow windows of opportunity, and moments where failure was measured not in embarrassment but in the permanent finality of death. In this way, the dagger, humble as it appeared, was not merely a weapon, It was a companion, a lifeline, and a symbol of the delicate balance that defined the assassin's world, where simplicity, precision, and adaptability outweighed grandeur, and where mastery was proven not in ceremony or display, but in the silent, unrecorded execution of a task whose success depended entirely on the synergy between hand, mind, and blade. Alongside the practical simplicity of daggers and blades, another instrument of the medieval assassin's grim trade existed in shadows, whispered about in fear and speculation: poison, a tool whose reputation often surpassed its reliability. A substance both feared and misunderstood. For while popular imagination paints it as a precise, elegant method of eliminating a target, the truth was far more capricious, hazardous, and unglamorous. A delicate and unpredictable art forged from herbs, minerals, mushrooms, occasionally the more exotic and grotesque ingredients sourced from nature's darker corners, where the line between lethal and ineffective was perilously thin. These concoctions, often brewed in secret, required not only intimate knowledge of natural substances, but also meticulous preparation for a misjudged amount, a slight error in timing, or even the difference between the freshness of one plant versus another could render the poison harmless, induce only temporary illness, or, worst of all, betray the assassin's intent, alerting the target to danger and potentially sealing their own fate in the process. Poison, in the hands of a medieval operative, was never a glamorous escape from physical confrontation. It was a gamble, a calculated risk that demanded both patience and nerve. A silent accomplice whose success relied as much on timing and opportunity as on chemistry. The process often involved gathering ingredients from forests, swamps, or markets, identifying the proper combinations through painstaking trial and error, grinding roots, leaves, and minerals into powders or pastes, and then disguising these deadly mixtures in wine, food, or other consumables, all while avoiding exposure or contamination. For one slip could result in injury or death to the handler. Unlike the neat, labeled vials of fiction, these poisons were crude, unstable, and mercurial. And the assassin's knowledge was gained through experience, observation, and sometimes bitter failure. A personal education written in accidental burns, illness, or the chilling realization that the effort had failed entirely. Yet, despite the risks and unpredictability, poison offered possibilities that weapons alone could not: the chance to strike unseen, to bypass guards, walls, and fortifications, to effect a silent removal without the chaos of a public altercation. And in a world where every moment of exposure could invite death, it was a tempting avenue for those daring or desperate enough to master it. The assassin had to understand the limitations, predict the reactions of the human body, and manipulate circumstances to maximize effect while minimizing personal danger, creating an intricate dance of observation, preparation, and stealth, where patience was as lethal as the substance itself. In this precarious balance, the humble poison became not a simple tool of death, but a reflection of the assassin's ingenuity, courage, and willingness to court danger in ways that were invisible to the untrained eye, proving that in a profession defined by shadows, subtlety and risk could be just as effective as speed, strength, or skill, and that the pursuit of survival often required mastering both the tangible and the intangible, the seen and the unseen in equal measure. Even with a dagger in hand and poison at their disposal, the medieval assassin faced a reality far more formidable than the act of striking a target: the sheer physical challenge of infiltrating the heavily fortified environments in which the powerful lived. Fort castles, far from being open homes or simple residences, were carefully designed labyrinths of stone, water, and danger, constructed not merely for aesthetic grandeur, but as intricate defensive machines meant to punish, ensnare, or destroy anyone daring enough to enter uninvited. Key in every step taken inside these walls was a calculated risk that could turn a carefully planned mission into a lethal trap. The first barrier, often moats filled with cold, biting water, could frustrate even the most agile of infiltrators, demanding careful navigation across slippery banks, hidden planks, or precarious ropes, each misstep risking a fall into freezing water or alerting a vigilant guard. And from there, the walls themselves rose, formidable and unyielding, built not to impress, but to repel, towering in height, thick with stone, and riddled with arrow slits that allowed defenders to rain precise, deadly projectiles down upon intruders, while remaining almost entirely protected themselves. A deadly calculus of offense and defense in which the slightest miscalculation could end a life before the dagger even left its sheath. And if the assassins somehow circumvented the moat and scaled the walls, other hazards awaited in almost theatrical cruelty. Murder holes that gaped ominously from battlements designed to pour boiling oil, scalding water, or even molten pitch upon anyone foolish enough to be beneath them, along with narrow corridors, hidden staircases, and traps that could turn a single misstep into crippling injury, all compounded by the ever-present threat of vigilant guards whose routines were finely tuned to detect the slightest anomaly, the faintest shadow, or the softest sound, forcing the intruder to move with unnatural stillness, attuning their body to every creak of the stone, every draft of air, and every flicker of candlelight, a high-stakes ballet in which hesitation could be fatal, and success demanded not just skill, but an almost preternatural awareness of the environment. In such a hostile landscape, preparation was essential, but never sufficient. Improvisation and acute perception were equally crucial. For the assassin could never fully predict the layout of a castle, the vigilance of its defenders, or the precise location of hazards hidden behind walls or beneath floors. And every step carried a weight of potential consequence that extended far beyond personal injury, for a single mistake could alert the household, compromise the mission, and set in motion a chain of events that could bring not only death, but the collapse of their clients' plans. The very architecture, designed to protect life and property, became an adversary in itself, demanding from the intruder a combination of physical skill, mental acuity, and nerve that few could sustain. And for those who survived these harrowing challenges, the tact of navigating a castle became a testament to their cunning, agility, and resilience, proving that in the deadly calculus of medieval assassination, the environment was as much a weapon as any dagger, and mastering it was often the difference between success, failure, and the finality of oblivion. Even after overcoming moats, scaling formidable walls, and dodging murderous defenses designed to punish the reckless, a medieval assassin faced yet another layer of danger, one that required not brute strength or poison, but the delicate art of social invisibility. The castle was alive with a constant hum of observation, a network of eyes and ears that extended far beyond the well-armed guards patrolling battlements. And it was within this subtle, bustling human environment that many assassins met their undoing. Servants moved with practiced efficiency, their eyes trained to notice inconsistencies, the faintest irregularities in routines, the unfamiliar shadow slipping too quickly past a corridor, or the slight misstep of a stranger fumbling with the chamber pots or pantry doors. And these seemingly inconsequential individuals, the cooks, the scribes, the stable boys, possessed knowledge and awareness that, when combined, created an almost invisible net of surveillance, a mesh of attention that could snare even the most experienced intruder in an instant. The assassin, no matter how skilled in climbing walls or wielding a dagger, had to navigate this living labyrinth with acute social awareness. Before one misplaced glance, one awkwardly timed footstep, one hesitated word could signal to a sharp-eyed servant that something was amiss. And the news would travel quickly through whispered corridors, carried from kitchen to hall, from stables to the main chamber, until it reached the ears of the very individuals trained, either by duty or instinct, to neutralize threats before they could manifest. Unlike the physical hazards of motes and boiling oil, these dangers required no steel, no trap, and no elaborate planning, only attentiveness, observation, and an unwavering understanding of human behavior. And the assassin had to move not just with caution, but with subtlety, blending into the cadence of the castle as if they belonged there, adopting the mannerisms of the household, anticipating the timing of footsteps, the rhythms of chores, and even the gossip that flowed quietly among those who, in their innocence, were the ultimate guardians of the household's secrets. In many ways, these individuals were the silent arbiters of the assassin's fate, their untrained vigilance often more lethal than any guard, for suspicion could spread like wildfire, turning a well-planned mission into a desperate scramble for survival, forcing the intruder to improvise in real time, to adapt to the constantly shifting patterns of daily life, and to master the unspoken codes of behavior that allowed them to pass unnoticed among those who, all their simplicity, held the power to betray with a single whispered observation. It was a subtle, psychological battlefield, where success depended not on speed or strength, but on perception, patience, and the delicate interplay of mimicry and misdirection. And those who underestimated the quiet, watchful presence of servants often discovered too late that the most dangerous adversaries in a castle were not the walls, the moats, or the arrow slits, but the very people who lived there, moving unseen and speaking softly, yet capable of unraveling even the most meticulous plan with a glance, a word, or the faintest hint of recognition. In addition to navigating alert servants in the maze-like architecture of castles, medieval assassins had to grapple with the deceptive simplicity of disguises, a challenge far more insidious than the walls or moats, because it relied not on physical skill, but on perception and social cunning. And yet, even here, their tools were woefully inadequate, for the available disguises of the time were crude at best, consisting of hooded cloaks, simple masks, or the borrowed garments of peasants and tradespeople, each intended to obscure identity, yet often achieving the opposite effect, drawing attention rather than diverting it. As the fabric hung awkwardly, the stitching betrayed foreign origin, or the mismatched ensemble marked the wearer as an outsider, someone who did not belong, someone whose very presence invited curiosity, suspicion, or worse, immediate confrontation. K, the assassin, trained in the lethal arts of stealth and precision, suddenly found themselves challenged by the subtler, far more insidious arts of mimicry and social camouflage, where a misjudged hat or a misaligned tunic could reveal them to the sharpest eyes before a dagger was even drawn, and where survival depended as much on blending into the rhythm of human behavior as it did on the mastery of poison or weaponry. Hoods might shield the face, but they also cast shadows that distorted expressions, making movements appear unnatural and drawing attention from observant household members, while masks, intended to anonymize, often had the opposite effect, creating an aura of peculiarity, strange unfamiliarity that made even the most disciplined servant glance twice and whisper to a companion, setting in motion a chain reaction of awareness that could spread faster than the assassin could react. Even simple gestures, the cadence of speech, and the choice of pathways within corridors had to be carefully considered, for every aspect of appearance and behavior could betray presence and intention. And in an environment where a single mistake could cascade into disaster, disguises became a test not only of adaptability, but of acute situational intelligence, forcing the operative to continuously adjust, rehearse, and anticipate responses, often in real time, while maintaining the composure required to execute the mission at hand. Thus, the very tools meant to protect the assassin's identity, the hoods, cloaks, and masks, became doubled instruments, their misuse capable of transforming stealth into spectacle. And in a profession where invisibility was paramount and discovery meant death, the challenge of disguise was not merely a question of concealment, but a complex dance of psychology, observation, and subtle manipulation, requiring the individual to move with an almost preternatural awareness of the perceptions of others, adapting to patterns of attention and expectation, and mastering a level of social intuition that could, in the end, determine whether they survived the assignment or became just another whispered story of failure hidden behind castle walls. Even within the underworld, a place already steeped in danger, cunning, and moral ambiguity, the medieval assassin occupied a unique and often terrifying position. For while thieves, smugglers, and other petty criminals operated according to familiar codes of conduct, shared secrets, and mutual survival instincts, the assassin stood apart, a figure whose work was defined by secrecy, lethal precision, and a willingness to extinguish life without hesitation. In this singular capacity for deadly efficiency bred an instinctive fear and suspicion among those who might otherwise have been allies, a quiet but pervasive tension that transformed potential companions into wary observers, reluctant collaborators, or complete avoiders. Within the dimly lit taverns, shadowed alleys, and crowded marketplaces where underworld figures congregated, gossip traveled fast, and the assassin's reputation, whispered in half-tones and nervous glances, preceded them like a shadow, creating a buffer of isolation. Even those who shared their craft understood that proximity could invite disaster, that a casual association could end with a dagger in the dark, and that any alliance, no matter how briefly forged, might evaporate under the weight of suspicion and survival instinct. This pervasive fear was not mere paranoia, for assassins were unpredictable, mobile, and often engaged in work that intersected with multiple networks of power, crime, and influence, and so their presence carried an implicit threat, a reminder that death could come silently and without warning, and that trust, even among those most accustomed to danger, is a currency too risky to spend. Thieves might trade information, smuggle goods, or engage in petty schemes together, but they understood instinctively that the assassin was an anomaly, someone whose allegiance was transient, whose loyalty was tied only to coin or survival, and whose very existence challenged the social equilibrium of the criminal community, compelling others to either maintain distance or disappear from their line of sight entirely. In this way, the assassin's isolation was both a shield and a burden, providing protection from potential entanglements while simultaneously reinforcing a profound loneliness where every glance turned away, every whispered warning, and every unspoken acknowledgement of fear served as a reminder that human connection, camaraderie, and trust were luxuries the assassin could rarely afford, and that even within a world accustomed to betrayal, violence, and cunning, their profession elevated them above suspicion into a realm of near mythical dread. It's a place where survival depended not just on skill with a blade or knowledge of poison, but on navigating a social terrain in which every ally was tentative, contact was measured, and every moment of exposure could signal the onset of danger that no physical weapon could counter, leaving them to walk a path as solitary as it was lethal. In the grim calculus of a medieval assassin's life, there was no room for error, no margin for misjudgment, for every action, every choice, and every movement carried consequences so severe that a single misstep could mean the difference between survival and an unmarked grave. And yet, unlike in stories where heroes stumble and rise again, in this world, failure was often absolute, unyielding, and final. And perfection was not an ideal or aspiration, it was the bare minimum requirement to see another sunrise, the invisible standard that governed every heartbeat, every breath, and every flick of a hand. The assassin had to internalize a discipline that encompassed not only physical skill with weapons, stealth, and poisons, but also the unrelenting mastery of timing, observation, patience, and psychological acuity. One misplaced step on a rooftop, one poorly judged glance in a candlelit corridor, or one hesitation at the wrong moment could alert a guard, expose an identity, and instantly transform opportunity into mortal peril. The constant pressure to execute flawlessly created a mental environment as lethal as the moats, arrow slits, and boiling oil they navigated. For the assassin lived with the knowledge that even a lifetime of skill could be nullified by a single error, a momentary lapse, or a subtle miscalculation. And this knowledge shaped every decision, turning the ordinary act of moving through a hallway or opening a door into a high-stakes negotiation with fate itself. Success, when it came, was fleeting and transient, measured not in accolades or recognition, but in survival in the completion of a single task without detection. For there was no accumulation of reputation or credit in this world. Every job was a discrete, isolated event, and the assassin's value was always judged by the immediacy of results, by the silent efficiency of a life taken, and by the ability to disappear into shadows afterward, without leaving even a whisper of evidence behind. In this unforgiving realm, perfection became a necessity, an invisible armor of discipline, foresight, and meticulous attention to detail. And even minor deviations from this standard could cascade into catastrophe, exposing identities, and transforming a calculated mission into a desperate flight from inevitable death. The assassin's existence, therefore, was defined as much by the mastery of failure as avoidance as by the accomplishment of their deadly objectives, a continuous, exhausting, and often solitary struggle to navigate a world in which the margin for error was non-existent, and the consequences of imperfection were absolute, leaving the individual to constantly balance skill, cunning, and instinct against the relentless, ever-present specter of mortality that shadowed every action, every night, and every breath in a life lived perpetually on the edge of finality. Beyond the physical hazards, the life of a medieval assassin inflicted wounds of a far more insidious and enduring nature. For the constant requirement of vigilance did not end with the completion of a mission. It seeped into every aspect of existence, transforming the very act of living into an unending exercise in paranoia, and turning spaces that were once ordinary into potential death traps, shadowed by unseen threats and whispered dangers. Every street, every alley, every flicker of movement in the corner of the eye became a puzzle of potential surveillance, and every encounter, no matter how mundane, demanded a careful weighing of risk, for the assassin could trust no one. Not the merchants who offered food, not the passers-by who seemed indifferent, and certainly not those within their own familiar circles. Because in a world where the same blade that claimed a target as life could just as easily claim the assassin as suspicion became instinct, and isolation became a constant companion. This relentless state of alertness forged a mind perpetually on edge. Sleep was a precarious luxury, and dreams themselves were tainted with anxiety, the subconscious replaying alleys, chambers, and faces over and over in a way that offered no solace, only a grim rehearsal of what could go wrong. For the assassin understood intuitively that the smallest lapse in attention might undo all prior planning and transform months of preparation into a fleeting, fragile illusion of security shattered in an instant. Friendships were impossible to maintain. Alliances were fleeting at best, and even the simple act of conversation carried the potential for betrayal. For words could be overheard, repeated, or twisted into evidence of intent, leaving the assassin perpetually on guard, measuring speech, posture, and expression as carefully as a blade in hand. And in this environment, human connection, normally a source of comfort, support, and camaraderie, became an unpredictable hazard, another variable in the complex equation of survival. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the psychological toll became cumulative. A subtle but relentless erosion of trust, certainty, and emotional stability, where loneliness was not merely the absence of companions, but the oppressive weight of knowing that every gaze might be a threat, every shadow a potential enemy, and every moment of relaxation a dangerous vulnerability. Paranoia intertwined with routine, turning ordinary tasks, crossing a street, entering a market, or even seeking shelter for the night into exercises in hypervigilance, and the assassin's mind, honed for observation and strategy, became a double-edged instrument, capable of extraordinary feats of awareness, while simultaneously amplifying fear, suspicion, and the sense of inescapable exposure. In the end, the assassin existed in a constant tension between mastery and vulnerability, skill and fear, presence and invisibility, where survival depended not only on physical ability, but on the endurance of a psyche tested beyond ordinary limits, and where the cost of living was measured not merely in coin or completed contracts, but in a quiet, knowing isolation that marked every heartbeat, every breath, and every shadowed step in a life perpetually poised on the edge of danger. In a world already defined by danger, where walls, moats, and sharpened steel were only the first layer of threat, the medieval assassin faced an even more insidious peril, the impossibility of trust. For the very people they might have relied upon, fellow thieves, hired allies, merchants, and even those who appeared innocent bystanders, could, in an instant, become instruments of their undoing, whether through fear, self-interest, or simple misperception. And so the assassin learned to move, not as a participant in the world around them, but as a ghost, an invisible presence threading through the rhythm of life with the meticulous precision of a shadow slipping across stone walls, always alert, always calculating, always acutely aware that any interaction could carry consequences as lethal as the dagger at their belt. Every encounter was filtered through layers of caution, every word carefully measured, and every gesture intentionally muted. For even a fleeting expression of emotion, a casual laugh, or a momentary glance in the wrong direction could unravel months of careful planning, exposing them to suspicion, betrayal, or violent reprisal. And in this environment, the very act of existing became an exercise in controlled invisibility, a constant performance in which the assassin had to mimic the rhythms of normal life, while simultaneously monitoring every detail of their surroundings, predicting the behavior of others, and anticipating every potential hazard, whether visible or hidden. The life of a ghost was not glamorous, not thrilling, and not even particularly empowering. For the freedom it offered was illusory, a freedom bound by the relentless necessity of concealment. A life in which every decision was calculated to reduce visibility, to minimize risk, and to maintain the delicate equilibrium between survival and discovery. Even in the rare moments of rest, the assassin could not fully relax, for dreams themselves were fraught with danger. Replaying alleys, rooftops, shadowed corridors, and the wary eyes of bystanders in an endless loop, reminding them that the world outside their own perception was unpredictable and often hostile, and that trust, a luxury enjoyed by most, was a liability for those who lived by the blade and in the shadows. Over time, this existence sculpted not just skill and cunning, but a psyche sharpened to a razor's edge, capable of extraordinary observation and strategic thought, yet also perpetually burdened by anxiety, suspicion, and the gnawing loneliness of invisibility. For to live like a ghost was to be perpetually on the threshold between life and death, constantly negotiating with danger, and eternally suspended in a state of hyper-awareness where even the faintest change in sound, scent, or movement could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. In essence, the assassin became both master and prisoner of their own survival instincts. An individual whose very presence in the world was defined by absence. His influence was measured not by relationships or alliances, but by the invisible threads of control they wielded from the shadows, and whose life, though brimming with peril and shadowed intrigue ultimately became a solitary, spectral existence in which the only certainty was that they must remain unseen, unheard, and untrusted, a ghost navigating a world perpetually poised to strike at any sign of weakness. For a medieval assassin, even the simplest human experience, sleep, love, companionship, or the fleeting comfort of ordinary conversation, were fraught with peril. Each one a potential vulnerability that could unravel the delicate thread of survival they fought so hard to maintain. And in a life where shadows were allies and trust was a liability, the very act of resting became a strategic calculation, a negotiation with risk, for falling asleep without absolute certainty of safety could invite intruders, betrayal, or the silent arrival of death. In the quiet moments that most people took for granted, the warmth of a hearth, the embrace of a partner, the laughter shared over a meal were luxuries that could compromise not only the assassin's anonymity, but the fragile equilibrium that separated life from oblivion. Love, in particular, was a treacherous and often forbidden territory, a domain where the heart and the head were in constant conflict, for attachment could cloud judgment, create predictable patterns, and expose emotional weaknesses that adversaries could exploit with devastating precision. And yet, despite this danger, the human longing for connection persisted, a reminder that beneath the hooded cloak pined the dagger, and within the calculating mind there existed a person yearning for warmth, understanding, and the brief illusion of normalcy, even if that very yearning carried the potential for ruin. To trust another, to invite them into the fragile bubble of one's life, was to gamble with fate itself, for every friend, lover, or companion became a potential witness, a possible betrayer, or an unintentional conduit to discovery. And so relationships were measured, tested, and often abandoned before they could grow, leaving the assassin to navigate the isolating tension between desire and self-preservation, between human need and lethal pragmatism. Even routine interactions, walking through a crowded market, exchanging pleasantries with a neighbor, or accepting food or lodging demanded constant calculation, observation, and preemptive planning. For every smile, gesture, or friendly word could hide suspicion, vigilance, or outright hostility, and misreading a single signal could result in exposure, injury, or death. Sleep itself was fragmented and shallow, taken in hidden alcoves, behind piles of refuse, or within abandoned structures, and it was punctuated by bursts of hypervigilance, the mind never truly at rest, ears attuned to the faintest creak of a floorboard or rustle of fabric, eyes scanning, even in darkness, for signs of intrusion, and every waking hour was similarly constrained by the necessity to remain invisible, measured, and elusive, a life lived perpetually in preparation for danger, a life in which the ordinary pleasures and rhythms of human existence were suspended in the unyielding shadow of mortality. In this world, the assassin existed as both observer and participant in the theater of life. Presence, defined less by interaction than by restraint, less by connection than by avoidance, and less by freedom than by the unrelenting demands of survival. For every heartbeat carried risk, every choice was a negotiation with unseen threats, and every moment of human intimacy was a calculated gamble against the ever-present specter of death that lingered in the shadows. A reminder that in the secret, shadowed world of medieval assassins, the most ordinary aspects of life, sleep, love, and human contact were themselves weapons that could either preserve or destroy, a delicate balance between life and oblivion. Among the shadowed arsenal of a medieval assassin, poison occupied a peculiar and paradoxical place. For while it promised a method of eliminating a target with subtlety and detachment, in reality it was an unforgiving, unpredictable, and often treacherous tool that demanded both skill and a deep understanding of nature's hidden properties. And even then, success was far from guaranteed, for the line between a carefully executed lethal dose and an ineffectual or self-defeating attempt was perilously thin. measured in the minutiae of timing, preparation, and the mercurial temperament of the ingredients themselves. Unlike the neat, precise toxins imagined in modern tales, medieval poisons were improvised from whatever plants, minerals, or occasionally animal byproducts could be gathered from forests, fields, or local apothecaries, requiring a painstaking process of identification, grinding, extraction, and combination, and each stage carried inherent danger. Called the assassin's survival depended on avoiding contamination, accidental exposure, or misjudgment, and one tiny miscalculation could result not in the quiet end of a target, but in a lingering, agonizing failure, or worse, self-inflicted injury. The preparation of such toxins was as much a science as it was an art, demanding not only patience, but also an intimate knowledge of local flora and fauna, of how certain herbs reacted under heat, pressure, or decay, and how mineral powders could alter or neutralize effects in ways both subtle and devastating. And even when all calculations were meticulously followed, the final result was never certain, for the body of a target might resist, metabolize, reject the poison in unpredictable ways, turning a supposedly fatal dose into a slow, inconclusive ordeal, leaving the assassin to grapple not only with the failure of the task, but with the increased risk of exposure, as prolonged suffering provided witnesses an opportunity for discovery. Moreover, the application of poison required caution that rivaled any stealth operation, for the assassin had to administer the substance in a manner that left no trace, aroused no suspicion, and allowed for plausible deniability, often blending it seamlessly into food, drink, or medicine, while simultaneously navigating the ever-present threat of unintended contamination. The reactions of servants, the scrutiny of household staff, and the unpredictable behavior of the target themselves. For a poisoned cup of wine could be spilled, swapped, or rejected, and a meal carefully prepared could be altered by another hand, rendering all preparation useless. Even the simplest poisons, derived from common herbs or minerals, required a level of precision and timing that few could consistently achieve. And the assassin had to reconcile the cold reality that failure could mean not only the survival of the intended victim, but the swift and brutal death of the assassin themselves, for clients rarely tolerated incompetence, and any mistake could be punished with fatal immediacy. Thus, poison, far from the glamorous, quiet instrument of power imagined in popular imagination, was instead a capricious, dangerous, and labor-intensive element of the assassin's repertoire. It's a tool that demanded patience, knowledge, and constant vigilance, and even then offered no guarantees beyond the hope that skill, timing, and fortune would align, leaving the assassin to navigate not only the physical hazards of their profession, but also the unpredictable whims of nature itself, where a single misstep could undo weeks of careful planning and reduce a calculated strike to chaos, and where survival depended as much on cunning observation and adaptability as it did on the lethal potential of the poison itself. In the clandestine world of medieval assassins, the very concept of success was paradoxical. For accomplishing the assigned task, the elimination of a target did not bring accolades, recognition, or even relief, but instead demanded a level of discretion so absolute that the moment the deed was done, the assassin effectively ceased to exist in the eyes of the client. And in the shadowed calculus of this perilous profession, survival was measured not by skill alone, but by the ability to vanish as completely as the target they had just silenced. Clients were ruthless architects of secrecy, demanding that every transaction, every encounter, and every action remain invisible, untraceable, and insulated from any human curiosity that might unravel their intentions. And in this unforgiving landscape, the assassin's identity became a liability rather than an asset, a dangerous thread that must be cut immediately to ensure the client's safety and, by extension, the assassin's continued survival. The brutal irony was that competence which in any other vocation might bring fame, security, or status, in this shadowed realm only heightened the necessity of erasure. For a job flawlessly executed required that no one, not even the target's closest allies or household staff, should possess knowledge of the perpetrator's existence, and that the fewer witnesses, the cleaner the record. The safer the client, the more likely the assassin was to live another day. In practical terms, this often meant that after a kill, the assassin had to dissolve into anonymity, shedding every identifying mark, every trace of presence, and every hint of connection to their work, disappearing into unfamiliar streets, distant villages, or entirely new identities, and doing so under the constant pressure that even a single misstep, a casual conversation, a recognized gesture, a known face could draw lethal attention from both the client and rival forces who might have been watching. In some of the darker twists of this secretive trade, the client's desire for security extended to preemptive betrayal, a reality in which one assassin might be hired to eliminate another immediately following the completion of a job, leaving no loose ends and ensuring that no living witness remained who could speak of the arrangement. And in such circumstances, loyalty was ephemeral, trust was non-existent, and survival hinged entirely upon the assassin's ability to anticipate not only the actions of their target, but the potential duplicity of the very individual who had paid for their skill. For in a world where the successful completion of a task rendered one invisible, failure or miscalculation meant immediate and often violent retribution. Thus, the life of a medieval assassin was defined by a cruel paradox. Excellence in execution did not earn praise. It earned erasure, and survival was not rewarded with rest or safety, but demanded continued vigilance, rapid disappearance, and the mastery of invisibility for the very act that fulfilled the client's needs. Simultaneously erased the assassin from the ledger of the living in practical terms, leaving them to navigate a world of shadows, constantly aware that their existence was both necessary and unwanted, visible only to themselves and fleetingly, dangerously relevant in a theater of secrecy, where the quietest success was measured not in applause, but in the ability to walk away unseen, unrecognized, and, if fortune allowed, alive, in the precarious and shadowed existence of a medieval assassin. The lines between power, survival, and mortality were drawn in blood and secrecy, and any hint of betrayal, deception, or ill-advised ambition could instantly transform the hunter into the hunted. For the very clients who had once entrusted their darkest desires to the assassin, skill, were also ruthless arbiters of punishment, ready to extinguish any perceived threat with merciless precision. And in this unforgiving calculus, even the suggestion of blackmail, whether subtle intimidation, a whispered demand, or an attempt to manipulate the outcome of a contract, was an act of suicidal audacity, a gamble where the odds were stacked, not in favor of negotiation, but in favor of absolute, irreversible elimination. Medieval assassins understood, often through grim experience rather than abstract warning, that their profession offered no margin for moral ambiguity or financial scheming, for every interaction was scrutinized, every word remembered, and every misstep potentially fatal. And they learned to navigate a world where loyalty was transactional, trust was non-existent, and the only currency of safety was obedience and discretion. For the moment one misjudged the intentions of a client, or allowed pride, greed, or resentment to interfere with the execution of their work, they risked not only losing the fee for which they had risked life and limb, but also the very breath that sustained them. In practical terms, this meant that the assassin's life was a tightrope stretched over an abyss of uncertainty, where the slightest tremor of ambition, the faintest flicker of self-interest, the softest whisper of a threat, could provoke swift and lethal retribution. And it was not enough merely to survive the act itself. One had to survive the aftermath, to navigate the treacherous currents of suspicion, paranoia, and human duplicity that followed every contract. For the most dangerous adversary often lay not in the castle walls or the target's household, but in the very individual who had placed the contract in motion. A client whose wealth, power, and reach could make even the most cunning assassin vanish without a trace. This reality forged a mindset that was as much psychological armor as it was practical skill, compelling assassins to cultivate patience, caution, and an almost preternatural ability to read the intentions of others, to anticipate threats not only from those they sought to eliminate, but from those who had hired them, and to suppress impulses that, in any other life, might be considered natural, human, or justified. For the failure to do so was an invitation to death, immediate and unmitigated, and in such a world, ambition, pride, and even survival instincts were tempered by the constant, knowing awareness that a single misjudgment could transform opportunity into execution, turning the assassin from shadowed agent into a permanent cautionary tale. Thus, betrayal or even the perception of duplicity was not merely a professional hazard, was a death sentence written in the silent, invisible ledger of medieval contracts, a grim reminder that, in a world defined by secrecy, skill, and survival, the line between life and death was not measured by courage, morality, or even talent, but by an unbroken chain of discretion, obedience, and the ability to remain, above all else, unseen, unheard, and utterly untrusting. For in this perilous dance of shadows, the moment one strayed from invisibility was the moment the world closed in with lethal finality. Beyond the shadowed alleys of medieval assassins and the treacherous calculus of life and death, history offers another arena of power, intrigue, and calculated ruthlessness in the form of Olympias, the formidable mother of Alexander the Great, whose mastery of strategy, politics, and uncompromising resolve allowed her not merely to survive the deadly currents of the Macedonian court, but to shape them entirely in service of securing her son's future as king. And in her story, we find a reflection of the same unforgiving logic that defined the assassin's world, though wielded not with daggers and poisons, but with alliances, manipulation, and the deft orchestration of both fear and loyalty. Olympias was no ordinary queen, and Macedonia was no ordinary kingdom. Born into the tribal lands of Epirus, she carried the weight of legendary ancestry, claiming descent from Achilles himself, and from a young age. She was steeped in ritual, prophecy, and the mystique of power, learning that in courts where ambition and betrayal were constant companions, survival required cunning, intelligence, and the willingness to wield cruelty as a deliberate instrument of control. When she married Philip II, a man whose ambition was as vast as his charm was dangerous, she entered a realm of political calculation where marriages were alliances, children were pawns, and every gesture was scrutinized for signs of advantage or threat. And she quickly recognized that her own survival, let alone her son's future claim to the throne, depended upon mastering the subtle art of influence, intimidation, and ruthless foresight. The court was a web of shifting loyalties in constant danger, where generals, nobles, and even family members could turn on one another without warning. And Olympias navigated this world with a mixture of calculated charm, religious authority, and the ever-present threat of reprisal, understanding that weakness invited immediate exploitation and that hesitation could cost not only prestige but life itself. She manipulated alliances, exploited rivalries, and sometimes orchestrated outright elimination of those who posed a threat to her son, ensuring that Alexander's path to kingship was cleared of both overt obstacles and the more insidious undercurrents of opposition that might undermine his legitimacy or power. And in doing so, she transformed her maternal role into a complex instrument of political strategy, where affection and ambition were inseparable, and ruthlessness became a form of protection, a means of guaranteeing the continuity of her family line in a kingdom that recognized only strength and cunning as guarantees of survival. Her tactics were not merely reactive, they were anticipatory, almost prophetic, guided by a keen understanding of human nature and courtly dynamics. And she wielded her influence with the precision of a master strategist, orchestrating marriages, alliances, and even threats of violence with the knowledge that every action resonated across the fragile balance of power in Macedon. Olympias was feared and respected, loved and despised, yet through every maneuver, she demonstrated that the consolidation of power in a royal court required more than brute force. It demanded vision, audacity, and an unflinching willingness to act decisively, often in ways that modern sensibilities might judge as cruel, but which, in her context, were the very mechanisms of survival and dominance. In the end, Olympias' legacy is inseparable from the rise of Alexander the Great, for it was her calculated ruthlessness, strategic genius, and unwavering dedication that cleared the path for a young boy to ascend as one of history's most legendary conquerors. And in her story, we are reminded that power, whether wielded with a dagger in the shadows or through the intricate dance of courtly politics, is rarely granted freely, always demands sacrifice, often requires acts that blurred the line between maternal devotion and cold-blooded strategy, leaving an indelible mark on both history and legend alike. Once Alexander had been firmly positioned as the heir to Macedonia, Olympias understood that securing his throne required more than ceremonial recognition or the approval of a grateful court. It demanded the active dismantling of any threat, whether that threat was overt, hidden, or merely whispered among the corridors of power. And in this ruthless calculus, she became both strategist and executioner, orchestrating alliances with deft subtlety while simultaneously removing those whose existence could challenge her son's claim, ensuring that the continuity of the royal bloodline was never compromised by ambition, dissent, or the unpredictable whims of men who saw opportunity in chaos. Her methods were as precise as they were chilling, blending political acumen with a willingness to employ intimidation, coercion, and even lethal force when necessary. For in a world where loyalty was fragile and succession a matter of survival rather than ceremony, hesitation could mean disaster, and failure could mean death, not only for her son, but for herself and her allies. And Olympias was not the kind to leave such matters to chance. She cultivated networks of influence across Epirus and Macedonia, subtly pitting nobles and generals against one another, leveraging rivalries and personal ambitions to isolate potential threats, while simultaneously rewarding compliance with protection, status, or even temporary positions of favor, creating a carefully choreographed dance in which her enemies were neutralized before they could act, and her allies remained pliant, yet useful in consolidating her son's power. Those who could not be swayed or coerced faced elimination in manners that were both practical and symbolic, serving as cautionary tales to others who might entertain ambitions contrary to the security of Alexander's rule. And Olympias' actions demonstrated an almost surgical precision in removing obstacles, for each decision was calculated to minimize backlash while maximizing the perception of inevitability surrounding her son's ascent, turning potential rebellion into fear, doubt into obedience, and uncertainty into a political landscape where the continuation of the royal bloodline became the unquestionable law of survival. What is remarkable about Olympias' approach is not merely the brutality of her methods, though they were undeniably fearsome, but the strategic brilliance that underlay every maneuver, for she understood the dual power of perception and action, and she wielded both to her advantage, manipulating marriages, forging temporary alliances, and eliminating rivals in ways that secured loyalty, instilled terror, and maintained the appearance of divine favor or inevitability, assuring that even those who survived her interventions could never fully act against her or her son without risking immediate reprisal. And in doing so, she demonstrated a profound understanding of power as a combination of fear, respect, and a careful orchestration of human ambition. In the end, Olympia's ruthless management of threats, combined with her subtle orchestration of alliances, created an unassailable foundation for Alexander's reign, a network of controlled influence and neutralized opposition that allowed him to focus not on internal disputes, but on the external conquests that would define his legacy. And through her actions, she left an indelible mark on history, not merely as the mother of a conqueror, but as a master tactician whose understanding of power, loyalty, and ruthlessness ensured that the royal bloodline of Macedonia would remain intact, vibrant, and unchallenged, testament to the fact that behind every great ruler often stands an equally formidable architect of strategy, foresight, and calculated force. As Olympias maneuvered through the treacherous currents of Macedonian politics, her presence became something larger than life. Terrors inspired both awe and terror for contemporaries and later chroniclers alike struggled to separate the tangible acts of her ruthless strategy from the aura of myth that seemed to cling to her every move. And in doing so, she transcended the ordinary boundaries of historical actors, becoming a figure whose story was recounted not merely as the tale of a shrewd and determined mother, but as a living legend whose influence shaped the destiny of an empire. Those who encountered her directly, whether as allies, rivals, or mere courtiers, understood the practical reality of her power, her ability to orchestrate outcomes with precision, to anticipate treachery, and to act with swift and unforgiving decisiveness. But for the wider populace, the stories of Olympias took on an almost supernatural quality, mingling fact with rumor, truth with embellishment, and history with myth, creating a narrative in which she was simultaneously feared as a woman capable of unimaginable cruelty and revered as a visionary guardian of the Macedonian lineage. It was said that her presence alone could command obedience, that her gaze carried the weight of prophecy, and that the consequences of defiance were immediate, uncompromising, and often fatal. Yet, these accounts, whether exaggerated by oral tradition or chroniclers seeking to capture the dramatic essence of her life, elevated her from the realm of mortal politics into the timeless sphere of legend, a figure whose cunning and resolve were amplified into epic proportions, showing that stories of her interventions, her orchestrated purges, and her intricate manipulation of the Macedonian court would resonate for centuries as cautionary tales and inspiring narratives alike. Olympias became a symbol of the intersection between maternal devotion and political genius, a reminder that in a world governed by power, fear, and ambition, influence could be wielded with precision equal to that of a sword, and that survival, continuity, and legacy often required acts that blurred the line between the human and the mythic. Even in her later years, as age tempered her physical presence, but not her intellect, Olympias continued to command attention and respect, and the stories that surrounded her, whether of her alleged mystical rituals, or fearless confrontations with would-be executioners, or her strategic guidance of Alexander's heirs, ensured that she would never be reduced to a footnote in history, but instead remembered as a figure whose very existence seemed to straddle reality and legend, embodying the power of cunning, foresight, and unrelenting determination, and leaving an indelible impression on the psyche of Macedonia, the narrative of her life becoming inseparable from the dramatic arc of her son's conquests and the turbulent, often violent, succession of events that followed. In essence, Olympias' life and actions illustrate how extraordinary intellect, audacious strategy, and ruthless pragmatism can simultaneously inspire fear and cultivate legend, reminding us that history is often shaped not only by the acts themselves, but by the stories we tell about them. And in Olympias' case, stories endure as much as the facts, ensuring that she remains an enduring symbol of maternal power, its political mastery, and the mythic potential of human agency in the turbulent theater of empire. Leaving behind the intrigues of Macedon and the legendary figure of Olympias, we turn our gaze to a far older world, a civilization whose mysteries still echo across the Aegean Sea, to the Minoans in their enigmatic palace of Knossos, sprawling architectural marvel that defies conventional understanding and immediately evokes the sense of a labyrinth, not merely in its physical layout, but in the layered complexity of its social, religious, and cultural functions, where corridors twisted and rooms interlocked in patterns that seemed deliberately designed to bewilder, protect, and inspire, creating a space where the boundaries between practical habitation, ceremonial ritual, and symbolic expression were fluid and intertwined. Walking through Gnosis would have been like entering a living puzzle, structure in which the scale, the light, and the circulation of space were orchestrated to evoke awe, to impose order on the imagination, and to reflect the sophistication of a civilization that understood the intricate relationship between architecture, symbolism, and human behavior, demonstrating that the Minoans were not merely builders, but storytellers, planners, and visionaries who embedded meaning into every stone, corridor, and fresco. The palace was not just a residence, it was a statement, a beating heart of a civilization that thrived on maritime trade, artistry, and ritual, a place where power and spirituality coexisted in tangible form. Its labyrinthine corridors served practical purposes as well, allowing the elite to move securely, protecting them from intruders, and creating layers of controlled access that would have been nearly impossible for outsiders to navigate. And yet, there was also an aesthetic intention, as the interplay of light and shadow, open courtyards, and hidden chambers transformed functional spaces into a dynamic experience, guiding the inhabitants and visitors alike through a carefully choreographed narrative of Minoan life, ritual, and belief, so that every turn and every hidden corner contributed to a greater understanding of order, hierarchy, and cosmology. But the legend of Gnosis goes beyond architecture. The labyrinthine nature of the palace inspired myths that would endure for millennia, the most famous of which is, of course, the tale of the Minotaur, a story in which the palace itself becomes as much a character as the beast is supposedly contained, a metaphor for complexity, danger, and the intertwining of civilization and myth. Scholars and archaeologists who study Gnosis today marvel not only at its engineering and artistry, but at the psychological impact it must have had on those who lived within or entered its confines. For the experience of moving through a space designed with such deliberate twists, turns, and surprises would have been both disorienting and awe-inspiring, reinforcing the power of the ruling elite, while embedding a sense of sacred mystery into the very fabric of daily life. Every fresco, every staircase, and every corridor hints at a people who were deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature, ritual, and society. For in Gnosis, the boundaries between art and architecture, between function and symbolism, blur seamlessly, revealing a culture that valued elegance, narrative, and experience as much as they did survival and governance. And even now, thousands of years later, the palace stands as a testament to human ingenuity, ambition, and the enduring power of myth to shape our understanding of history, inviting us to step into a world where reality and legend are intertwined, where each turn of a corridor might reveal beauty, mystery, or a story waiting to unfold, and where the labyrinth itself becomes a metaphor for the depth, complexity, and enduring fascination of the Minoan civilization. While many ancient civilizations built grand palaces and fortresses as a testament to their military might, the Palace of Gnosis tells a profoundly different story. One not of conquest or dominance through force, but of a society deeply invested in ritual, myth, and the refinement of cultural expression. For the architecture itself, with its labyrinthine corridors, hidden chambers, and flowing courtyards, suggests a civilization that sought to harmonize the physical and spiritual realms, crafting spaces that facilitated ceremonies, celebrated artistic expression, and reinforced the social and religious order in ways that were subtle yet powerful, conveying meaning and significance through design as much as through words or decree. Every fresco and painted wall in Gnosis reveals a people attuned not to the glorification of battle, but to the rhythms of life, the cycles of nature, and the profound interconnectedness of human existence and the divine, depicting scenes of dancers, acrobats, leaping dolphins, and sacred bulls, all captured with the fluidity and energy that evoked movement, ritual, and the celebration of life itself. Rather than the rigid, static imagery of soldiers or battlefield triumphs, and even the architectural layout of the palace seems designed to complement these artistic expressions, guiding inhabitants through spaces that intertwine function, ceremony, and aesthetic wonder in ways that reinforce the cultural sophistication of the society and the sanctity of its traditions. The Minoans understood that power could manifest not only in military conquest, but in the orchestration of daily life, ritual, and public spectacle, embedding lessons, values, and beliefs directly into the built environment, so that moving through Gnosis was simultaneously a practical experience, a spiritual journey, and an engagement with the mythic narratives that shaped Minoan identity, where each corridor, chamber, and courtyard contributed to a larger story of social cohesion, reverence for nature, and celebration of human potential. This focus on ritual and cultural sophistication over conquest also suggests a worldview in which influence was measured less by the number of enemies defeated and more by the harmony achieved between human, divine, and natural realms, a vision of civilization as a living, breathing organism in which art, architecture, and spirituality were inseparable from the governance and social organization that sustained the community. In many ways, Gnosis serves as a reminder that the greatest civilizations leave behind more than walls or weapons. They leave behind a philosophy of life encoded in the spaces they inhabit. Test, a reflection of priorities, beliefs, and values that transcends generations. And even millennia later, when archaeologists and historians walk through its remnants, they are confronted not with the echoes of battles fought, but with the whispers of festivals, the rhythm of ceremonial dances, and the enduring message that culture, ritual, and the thoughtful expression of human creativity can define a civilization as powerfully as any conquest, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire awe and wonder in every corridor, fresco, and labyrinthine passage of the palace. Despite the grandeur of Gnosis, the intricate labyrinth, the vibrancy of Minoan culture, Tekla, the civilization that had once thrived across the Aegean, was not immune to the unpredictable forces of nature. And by around 1400 BCE, the Minoans mysteriously vanished from history, leaving behind their palaces, frescoes, and artifacts as silent witnesses to a society that had once flourished with remarkable artistry and sophistication. It succumbed to circumstances beyond their control, circumstances that continue to puzzle historians and archaeologists to this day. Among the theories that attempt to explain this sudden disappearance, the most compelling is the eruption of the volcanic island of Thera, known today as Santorini. It's an event so catastrophic that it sent shockwaves through the region, not only reshaping the geography, but potentially creating tsunamis, ash clouds, haze, and climate disturbances that could have devastated agricultural production, disrupted trade networks, and led to widespread social collapse, effectively dismantling the intricate social and political structures that had sustained the Minoan way of life for centuries. Imagine the scene: the sky darkened with ash, waves higher than any ship had seen before crashed upon the shores. Tana, a society that had celebrated life, dance, and ritual, suddenly faced chaos, destruction, and uncertainty, where the very palace that had been a symbol of cultural sophistication may have been damaged, abandoned, or overwhelmed by the forces of nature, leaving its halls empty, its frescoes fading, and its corridors echoing with the silence of a civilization cut off at its peak. Yet, the Minoans were not mere victims of circumstance. They had endured challenges, navigated the complexities of trade, ritual, and politics, and built a society whose sophistication rivaled any in the ancient world. But even the most innovative civilizations are vulnerable to the unpredictability of the natural world. And in the case of the Minoans, Stera may have been the tipping point that transformed a thriving culture into a memory preserved only in ruins, myth, and archaeological discovery. What remains of Gnosis, its frescoes, pottery, and architectural ingenuity, continues to captivate modern scholars and storytellers alike, offering glimpses into a society that understood the interplay of beauty, ritual, and daily life, yet was ultimately at the mercy of forces far larger than human ambition or skill, reminding us that history is not always written by conquest or politics, but sometimes by the quiet, unstoppable, and unpredictable hand of nature, which can erase even the most sophisticated achievements almost overnight, leaving behind questions, mysteries, and stories that inspire generations to wonder what was lost and how much of human ingenuity can endure in the face of natural catastrophe. In this sense, the disappearance of the Minoans and the silent corridors of Gnosis stand as both a testament to human creativity and a cautionary tale, illustrating that no matter how advanced or refined a civilization becomes, it remains intertwined with the natural world, vulnerable to its whims, yet capable of leaving behind a legacy that continues to spark imagination, exploration, and the eternal search for understanding, making the story of the Minoans as compelling as the myths they inspired and as haunting as the empty labyrinths they left behind. Centuries later, long after the Minoans had faded into legend and the corridors of Gnosis had been swallowed by earth, vegetation, and time, the ruins lay quietly beneath the sun-baked hills of Crete, a labyrinthine puzzle waiting to be unraveled, until Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for drama, vision, and an almost obsessive curiosity for the ancient world, arrived in the early 20th century with a determination to uncover the secrets of this long-forgotten civilization, bringing with them not only the tools of excavation, but a vivid imagination and an unshakable belief that within the crumbling walls and scattered fragments of pottery lay a civilization that could reshape our understanding of early European history. Evans did not merely dig. He sought to breathe life back into Gnosis, interpreting its labyrinthine architecture, vibrant frescoes, and intricately designed spaces as evidence of a society that valued artistry, ritual, and human experience over conquest. A people who had woven meaning into every stone, every corridor, and every open courtyard. And through his painstaking work, he began to reveal the scale, ambition, and sophistication of a culture that had long been obscured by time, natural disasters, and myth. Evans' vision of Gnosis was both revelatory and controversial. He imagined a palace that was not merely administrative or defensive, but deeply expressive, a place that reflected the spiritual, social, and cultural sophistication of the Minoans, and in doing so, he transformed what had been a forgotten ruin into a narrative of human ingenuity, artistry, and mystery, where each fresco of dancers, leaping dolphins, and sacred bulls told a story about a civilization attuned to nature, ritual, and the celebration of life, rather than to war or conquest. In each corridor, stairwell, and hidden chamber hinted at the careful planning, ritual significance, and aesthetic sensibility of the people who had built it, guiding scholars and visitors alike through a journey that blurred the lines between history, myth, and imagination. Yet Evans' work was not without debate. His reconstructions, interpretations, and restorations were sometimes speculative, influenced by the vision of what he believed the Minoans had been. But even critics acknowledged that his discoveries provided an invaluable window into a society that had been lost to time, revealing that Gnosis was more than just a building. It was the heart of a civilization whose art, architecture, and rituals embodied an extraordinary understanding of human experience, social cohesion, and spiritual expression, and through Evans' efforts, the echoes of the Minoans continue to resonate, inviting us to walk their corridors in our imagination, to marvel at their frescoes, and to ponder the intricate balance between human creativity, environmental forces, and the enduring power of culture to shape both our past and our understanding of what it means to be a sophisticated, artistic, and resilient society. Evans' rediscovery reminds us that history is never truly lost. It waits patiently, sometimes for centuries, for someone willing to uncover it, interpret it, and allow its stories, lessons, and beauty to speak across time, bridging the gap between the civilizations that came before us and the modern world eager to understand them. And in the labyrinth of gnosis, it's both literal and metaphorical, we find a testament to human curiosity, perseverance, and the enduring allure of mystery, where the past continues to challenge, inspire, and captivate our imagination. As the Minoans faded into memory and human civilization marched onward, the focus of societies shifted from the subtle sophistication of ritual and art to the harsh realities of conflict and conquest. And nowhere was this more dramatically illustrated than in the evolution of siege warfare, where the ingenuity of engineers and the brute force of physics collided to reshape the fate of kingdoms, cities, and empires. And central to this transformation were the massive, awe-inspiring machines designed to breach even the most formidable walls, with battering rams, catapults, and trebuchets serving not merely as tools of destruction, but as embodiments of strategic thinking, mechanical innovation, and the psychological theater of war. Battering rams, often enormous logs, reinforced with iron and mounted on wheels, or suspended from frames, were swung with relentless rhythm against gates and walls, each strike sending vibrations through stone and timber alike, testing the limits of construction and endurance, while soldiers behind the protective coverings coordinated their efforts with meticulous timing and unwavering determination, knowing that a single misstep could mean death, and that the success of the assault depended as much on precision and persistence as it did on raw force. Meanwhile, catapults emerged as the architects of chaos from a distance, hurling stones, flaming pitch, or even the occasional diseased carcass into the heart of a besieged city, combining physical destruction with psychological terror. For the residents within walls knew that any target, be it a courtyard, a barracks, or a supply depot, could suddenly erupt in smoke, fire, and ruin, transforming familiar spaces into a landscape of unpredictability and fear, a constant reminder of the attacker's dominance and the fragility of human habitation when faced with the relentless ingenuity of siegecraft. Trebuchet, the crowning achievement of pre-gunpowder engineering, elevated the art and science of siege warfare to new heights, capable of flinging massive stones or incendiary devices with terrifying accuracy and devastating force, their counterweighted beams and carefully calculated arcs embodying the intersection of mathematics, mechanics, and human ingenuity. And their operation demanded not only strength, but expertise, coordination, and a deep understanding of trajectory, leverage, and timing, as even a minor miscalculation could reduce a potentially decisive strike into a wasted effort, leaving attackers exposed and vulnerable to counterattack. These engines, while destructive, were also instruments of strategy and spectacle. The sight of a trebuchet poised to launch, the rhythmic creaking of its arm, and the moment of release carried as much psychological weight as the physical damage, sending a message to defenders that their walls, no matter how high or fortified, were temporary obstacles in the path of inevitable force, and that patience, resilience, and creativity would be tested at every turn. In the chaotic interplay of offense and defense, siege engines transformed battles from simple confrontations into complex contests of engineering, endurance, and ingenuity, where success required both human skill and mechanical mastery. And failure could spell disaster, not just for the soldiers operating the machines, but for the communities they sought to conquer or protect. Illustrating that warfare in the ancient world was as much about innovation, calculation, and psychological dominance as it was about courage, numbers, or brute strength, and that the legacies of these formidable engines would echo through history, inspiring future generations to blend science, strategy, and spectacle in the art of war. While the roar of trebuchets, the crashing of battering rams, and the thundering impact of catapulted stones were undeniably terrifying, the true genius of siege warfare lay not merely in the capacity to tear down walls or collapse fortifications, but in its ability to play upon the minds of those trapped behind them. For every stone hurled, every flaming projectile, and every deafening impact was designed not just to break masonry, but to chip away at courage, hope, and the very will to resist, turning defenders into shadows of their former selves, constantly on edge and teetering on the brink of despair, where the mind often gave in before the body ever had to. Imagine the city under siege, the night sky illuminated intermittently by fire arrows streaking like deadly comets, the smell of smoke and burning pitch thick in the air, walls trembling with each calculated strike, and within, soldiers and civilians alike are gripped by creeping, almost inescapable terror, their nerves frayed, sleep impossible, in every decision, from rationing water to reinforcing gates, weighed down by a gnawing awareness that the enemy is patient, relentless, and indifferent to human suffering, waiting for the precise moment when fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty will fracture the defenders' unity, making them vulnerable not only to physical assault, but also to psychological collapse. Commanders understood that in siege warfare, the mind could be a far more dangerous adversary than any soldier on the battlefield, and they often leveraged this insight with deliberate acts designed to manipulate perception, morale, and expectation, launching dead animals or severed heads over the walls to spread disease and terror, maintaining the ominous rhythm of attacks without pause to prevent rest or relief, and even orchestrating moments of calculated mercy or provocation to sow confusion and discord among defenders, forcing them to question leadership, strategy, and the very possibility of survival. In such a scenario, the fortress, which at once represented security, order, and control, transformed into a prison of dread where every sound, shadow, or unexpected motion could signal imminent danger, and where paranoia became an inseparable companion to vigilance, further blurring the line between reality and the exaggerated fears planted by the relentless ingenuity of the besiegers. The psychological dimension of siege warfare also extended to manipulation of time, for prolonged sieges tested endurance as much as skill, with weeks, months, or even years designed to erode patience and sap energy, compelling defenders to make errors born of desperation, miscommunication, or sheer exhaustion, effectively turning their own survival instincts against them. And often, the final surrender occurred not because the walls had fallen or the gates been breached, but because the defenders' minds had surrendered first, their collective morale shattered under the unrelenting pressure of strategy, spectacle, and the invisible weight of impending doom. Through this lens, siege warfare emerges not merely as an exhibition of mechanical destruction or brute force, but as a sophisticated interplay of engineering, strategy, and human psychology, where the conquest of a city or a fortress relied as much upon the ability to bend minds to despair as it did upon the physical collapse of stones and timber, demonstrating that in the ancient and medieval world, mastery of human perception was often the most decisive weapon in the arsenal, and that the legacy of these battles is a testament to the understanding that war, at its core, is as much a battle of nerves, patience, and fear as it is of strength, numbers, and skill. Yet, while attackers devised ingenious methods to break morale and destroy fortifications, defenders were far from passive spectators in this high-stakes contest of strategy, skill, and survival. For the art of defense demanded equal creativity, resourcefulness, and cunning, transforming every siege into a dynamic battle of wits as much as strength, where the ingenuity of those within the walls could turn apparent weakness into formidable advantage, and the smallest act of cleverness might spell the difference between survival and annihilation. Flooding moats, for instance, was not a mere precautionary measure, but a deliberate manipulation of the environment, converting what might have seemed like a static barrier into a shifting, treacherous obstacle that could halt siege engines, undermine battering rams, and force attackers to navigate water, mud, and muck under relentless defensive fire, turning the natural landscape into an extension of human ingenuity and a weapon in its own right. Where a misstep could drown a man, destroy equipment, or stall an entire offensive for precious days or weeks, buying the defenders time to regroup, reinforce, and exploit every tactical advantage. In addition to manipulating water, defenders often constructed secondary walls or inner fortifications, creating layered obstacles designed not merely to slow the enemy, but to fracture their momentum and expose vulnerabilities in their formations, where each successive gate, rampart, or barricade became an opportunity to funnel attackers into kill zones, ambushes, or traps, and to exploit fatigue, fear, and the psychological strain already imposed by relentless bombardment, transforming the fortress into a multi-dimensional puzzle where the besiegers' every step was anticipated, countered, and exploited, and where the defenders' foresight and preparation turned what might have seemed like a simple siege into a prolonged, exhausting test of patience, resilience, and tactical acumen. Sabotage, too, played a critical role in the defenders' repertoire, ranging from undermining siege engines and cutting ropes to secretly collapsing earthworks or gates, to poisoning wells or launching counterattacks at exposed crews. Each act, a calculated gamble that could inflict disproportionate damage on the enemy, shattered their morale, and create the illusion that forces within the walls were greater, more cunning, or more omnipresent than they truly were, reinforcing the psychological warfare already imposed by the ceaseless noise, fire, and destruction raining down from above. In this intricate dance between attack and defense, every decision carried weight, every miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences, and every act of ingenuity became a lifeline, a shield, and a statement of human resilience against overwhelming odds, illustrating that the story of siege warfare was never solely one of brute force or engineering marvels, but of adaptability, creativity, and the relentless human drive to survive even when the odds appeared insurmountable. Through these tactics, defenders demonstrated that the fortress was more than stone and timber. It was a living, breathing instrument of strategy, where innovation, cunning, and resourcefulness could turn walls into labyrinths, moats into traps, and the most confident attackers into weary, uncertain intruders, revealing that in the high-stakes theater of medieval and ancient warfare, the greatest victories were often not won by sheer power, but by minds attuned to opportunity, patience, and the endless interplay of threat and countermeasure, proving that in every siege, as in life, creativity and foresight could become the most powerful weapons of all. As centuries passed, and the relentless cat-and-mouse game between attackers and defenders unfolded across countless cities, castles, and fortresses, human ingenuity never stagnated. For the evolution of siege technology was a story of adaptation, experimentation, and the unyielding pursuit of advantage, and nowhere was this more dramatically illustrated than in the gradual, transformative introduction of gunpowder and cannons, which would not merely enhance existing methods of assault, but utterly redefine the nature of medieval warfare, rendering stone walls and layered fortifications increasingly vulnerable, shifting the balance of power in ways previously unimagined by commanders steeped in centuries of traditional tactics. Imagine, if you will, the towering castles that had once seemed impregnable, massive walls of carefully cut stone, reinforced gates, inner keeps, and labyrinthine passages designed to exhaust, confuse, and repel any would-be invader. And then, one day, the thunderous roar of a cannon shattered the silence, hurling iron projectiles with terrifying velocity and unerring force against the very stones that had withstood generations of battering rams, trebuchets, and catapults, splintering masonry, collapsing towers, and creating breaches that turned once formidable fortresses into precarious, crumbling shells, where defenders were forced to reconsider every assumption about the durability of their walls, the sufficiency of their fortifications, and the reliability of long-established defensive strategies. The arrival of gunpowder weaponry introduced not only unprecedented physical destruction, but also a new dimension of psychological warfare. To the deafening explosions, the sudden shattering of stone and timber, and the unpredictable trajectories of cannonballs, instilled a level of fear and uncertainty that traditional siege engines had never achieved, challenging even the most disciplined defenders to maintain order, morale, and coordination amidst the chaos, and compelling military architects and engineers to rethink design principles entirely, experimenting with angled bastions, thicker walls, and lower, more resilient fortifications that could better absorb shock, deflect fire, and protect inhabitants from the growing arsenal of artillery now dominating the battlefield. Moreover, the evolution of siege technology did not occur in isolation. It fundamentally altered tactics, strategy, and even politics, for the power to wield cannons and gunpowder effectively became a defining feature of military dominance, allowing ambitious rulers to threaten, coerce, or conquer previously secure strongholds with far less manpower, turning long-standing stalemates into decisive campaigns, and reshaping the geopolitical landscape as kingdoms with access to these new technologies gained leverage over those still reliant on older methods. The implications were profound. Siege warfare was no longer merely a contest of patience. Engineering and psychological endurance had become an arena where innovation, scientific understanding, and industrial capability dictated victory, where centuries-old assumptions about the invincibility of walls were appended by chemistry and mechanics, and where the art of war expanded to embrace not only strategy and human cunning, but also the destructive power of fire, explosion, and the unforgiving law of physics. In essence, the introduction of gunpowder and cannons marked a turning point in human conflict, a moment when the medieval world glimpsed the future of warfare, where the careful calculations of engineers and the bravery of soldiers remained crucial, but where the sheer, overwhelming force of technology had begun to dictate outcomes in ways both terrifying and awe-inspiring, heralding a new era in which the combination of intellect, invention, and raw destructive power would forever alter the nature of conquest, defense, and the human experience of battle, and reminding us that in the story of war, innovation is as potent a weapon as courage, loyalty, or strategy, capable of rewriting the rules of survival and transforming the very landscape of history. As we reflect on the shadowed world of medieval assassins, it becomes clear that the romanticized image of a lone, heroic figure silently stalking corridors by moonlight is far removed from reality, for these were not warriors chosen for glory, nor agents of destiny trained in secret temples. Rather, they were often the desperate, overlooked, and discarded members of society, peasants crushed by circumstance, graced soldiers whose honor had been shattered, or ex-thieves whose skills had no lawful outlet, people pushed to the edge of survival by a world that offered little mercy. Becoming an assassin was rarely a deliberate career choice. It was a forced path, a last resort for those who had nowhere else to turn, where secrecy was not an art, but a necessity, and survival was never guaranteed. Many did not live long after completing an assignment, their fate sealed by the very clients who had summoned them, and their stories vanished into the quiet corners of history, remembered, if at all, only as unsettling footnotes. Training, if it could even be called that, offered no instruction manuals, number mentors whispering secrets by candlelight, no inspiring montages to steel the mind or body. The learning curve was brutal, composed entirely of trial and error, bruises, blood, and the relentless test of instinct against circumstance. Every decision carried weight, every movement demanded precision, and every night spent lurking in shadows required an intimate understanding of one's environment and an unflinching reliance on personal skill. There was no margin for error, and perfection was not merely admired, it was the difference between life and death. For mistakes in this line of work were unforgiving, and every miscalculation could prove fatal. Money was the driving force behind many assassins' grim endeavors, though it was as unreliable as it was alluring. These assignments were temporary, singular, and transactional, offering no security, no loyalty, no assurance of future gain, and clients often sought plausible deniability, sometimes even commissioning rival assassins to eliminate the first once the deed was done. Weapons were simple and practical, sharp daggers rather than ornate blades, poisons that were unpredictable, cobbled together from plants, minerals, or other rudimentary ingredients, making every attempt to end a life as much a gamble as a calculation. Physical infiltration brought its own perils, as moats, walls, arrow slits, and even boiling oil turned castles and fortified homes into death traps where a single misstep could spell doom. Stealth, too, was a precarious art. Servants, scribes, cooks, and stable boys, those whose eyes and ears were everywhere, could expose an intruder at any moment. While disguises were rudimentary at best, often drawing more attention than providing concealment, and even fellow criminals regarded assassins with wariness, fearing their unpredictability and the danger they fostering attracted. Paranoia, living in constant vigilance, exacted a psychological toll. And the impossibility of trust, leaving these men and women to wander through life like ghosts, where sleep, love, or ordinary human interactions could become sources of risk, and even the simplest indulgences carried consequences. The same lessons of strategy, risk, and power reverberate in the grander halls of history, exemplified by Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great, who demonstrated that political survival often demanded ruthlessness and ingenuity. Through eliminating rivals and manipulating alliances, she safeguarded her son's claim to the throne. Her actions alternately feared and mythologized, reminding us that the exercise of influence, much like the work of an assassin, relied on foresight, precision, and the delicate balance of courage and calculation. Similarly, the Minoan palace of Gnosis illustrates the heights of cultural sophistication, reflecting ritual and myth, and designed like a labyrinth, not for war, but as an expression of social and spiritual complexity, whose civilization mysteriously vanished around 1400 BCE, perhaps due to natural disasters, only to be rediscovered centuries later by Sir Arthur Evans, revealing the enduring power of human ingenuity, creativity, and resilience, even in the brutal theater of siege warfare. These principles played out. The psychological and physical dimensions of battering rams, catapults, and trebuchets, combined with clever defensive measures like flooding moats, constructing secondary walls, or engaging in sabotage, created a dialogue of strategy and counter-strategy that demanded both intellect and courage. Over time, the arrival of gunpowder and cannons transformed these contests completely, rendering previous defenses obsolete and ushering in a new era of military technology where the landscape of conflict and survival was forever altered. Across these stories, from assassins navigating shadows to queens securing dynasties, from labyrinthine palaces to thunderous siege engines, we witness a consistent truth. History is shaped by those who adapt, calculate, and act decisively, often in the most extreme circumstances, reminding us that courage, ingenuity, and an understanding of human nature have always been as vital as strength or weaponry. So, as you lie down tonight, let these tales of peril, strategy, and human resilience remind you of the depth and complexity behind every historical legend, and of the countless lives that lived on the edge of shadow and light, shaping the world in ways we can still marvel at today. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you through the corridors of history, guided by curiosity, reflection, and the quiet thrill of stories waiting to be discovered. Good night.